Welcome, friends. Tonight, we step into the echoing stone corridors of a medieval castle. The torches flicker along damp walls, and the wind whistles through cracks in heavy wooden doors. From the outside, it looks romantic, a place of knights, feasts, and fairy tales. But live here for even one night, and the dream quickly shatters. The truth is simple. Castles were freezing. Without central heating, insulated windows, or even a proper mattress, your greatest enemy wasn't invading armies. It was the cold. Imagine walking across the flagstone floor of a vast chamber. Each step scrapes against stones polished by centuries of feet. The walls don't just resist warmth, they devour it. Those same thick defenses that stopped battering rams turned the castle into a refrigerator. By nightfall, the inside temperature dropped almost as quickly as the air outside. You'd see your breath fogging before your face. Yes, fireplaces roared, but their heat only reached a small circle around the flames. 10 feet away, you were shivering again. Many travelers wrote of frost forming on the insides of bedrooms, wash basins frozen solid, and icicles hanging from bed curtains. This wasn't unusual, it was normal. So how did people survive? Ritual and strategy. At night, households shrank their living spaces. Fires were banked, beds surrounded by heavy curtains, and every scrap of fabric was layered for warmth. Beds were raised high above the ground to escape the coldest air near the floor. Sometimes the only real comfort came from sharing a bed with family, servants, or even dogs. The great hall was the heart of survival. Here, long trestle tables stretched across a smoky chamber, warmed by a massive hearth. Feasts weren't just about food, they were heating sessions. Hundreds of bodies gathered close together, generating warmth before everyone faced the icy chambers above. But when the fire burned low, the hall fell silent and the cold returned. Moving from the hall to your bed was a dreaded journey. The warmth clung to you only for moments. Climb the spiral stairs, and a knife of icy air rushed through arrow slits. Many nobles delayed leaving the hall as long as possible. Some even slept on benches by the embers, rather than return to their chambers. Inside your room, the reality hit. Thick stone walls wept with condensation. Moss sometimes grew indoors. Tapestries and hangings tried to soften the drafts, but scholars still debate how much difference they really made. The truth, cold always won. Floors were strewn with rushes, grasses laid to insulate and absorb spills. Freshly spread, they smelled earthy, like summer carried indoors. But by winter's end, they were foul, filled with scraps, bones, and mice. In castles, every night was a battle. Sleep wasn't rest, it was survival. Layered furs, heavy curtains, hot stones, and even animals in the bed were weapons against the freezing dark. And yet, people endured. They found ways to live, adapt, and push through nights that would make most of us surrender. So the next time you settle into your modern, heated home, spare a thought for those who lay shivering in vast stone chambers. For them, warmth was fleeting, fragile, and always fought for. The night inside a medieval castle was not silent. Even when torches were extinguished and the hall fell into darkness, the castle itself seemed alive. The wind moaned through arrow slits, rattling shutters and whispering in the rafters. Rats scurried across rushes, scratching at scraps of food long forgotten. Somewhere in the dark, the deep bark of a hound echoed, its chain clinking against stone. For nobles, sleeping chambers offered only the illusion of comfort. Their four-poster beds stood tall, draped in heavy curtains that turned the bed into a private tent. Without them, drafts would have stolen every ounce of warmth. Within those curtains, the air was marginally warmer, but only because bodies and breath slowly filled the small space. And yet, these beds were not the soft feathered clouds we imagine. Mattresses were often stuffed with straw, feathers if you were lucky, but the straw grew damp from the cold and had to be replaced frequently. Beneath, a wooden frame creaked with every movement. Sleep was restless, interrupted not only by the cold, but by the sounds of the night. Servants fared far worse. They often lay on pallets of straw spread across hard floors, wrapped in rough wool blankets that barely kept out the chill. In some castles, servants even slept in the kitchens, near the embers of cooking fires, because anywhere else was unbearable. Consider this. In the dead of winter, water in pitchers froze solid. Ink in writing rooms thickened to sludge. One chronicler even wrote of wine turning to ice at the high table during supper. The very stones of the castle seemed to freeze from the inside out. But cold was not the only challenge. Darkness itself was terrifying. After nightfall, a castle plunged into shadow. A single candle barely pierced the gloom, its small flame throwing monstrous shapes onto the walls. Superstition thrived in this darkness. Whispers of spirits, demons, and restless souls drifting through the halls. For many, the night was not only physically dangerous, but spiritually unsettling. The wealthy tried to combat this with innovation. Heated stones were placed at the foot of beds, wrapped in cloth to prevent burns. Brass bed warmers filled with glowing coals were passed between sheets before sleep. Yet, these comforts were fleeting. The stones cooled quickly, the embers died, and the cold crept back in. In some castles, entire families, parents, children, even retainers, slept together in one chamber. The body heat of many people was the strongest defense against the night. Dogs, too, were prized companions, lying close to feet and legs, their warmth far more reliable than fading embers. And in those long, bitter nights, the human imagination filled the darkness. The creak of beams might become the tread of ghostly knights, the flutter of a bat, a whisper of the devil, a distant cry, perhaps a banshee foretelling death. Medieval life was steeped in faith and fear, and the cold silence of a castle magnified both. Yet, despite all this, castles were not abandoned. People endured because they had no choice. Lords ruled from these icy fortresses. Families grew within their walls. Children laughed in courtyards. And life continued, built on resilience, habit, and the stubborn human will to survive. So remember this. When you look at a castle today and admire its towering majesty, know that within those stone walls, survival was a nightly struggle. Romance and legend came later. Reality was frost on the walls, breath steaming in the dark, and the endless hope that morning would bring light and warmth once again. When we imagine the medieval castle, we often picture its grand hall, alive with feasting, music, and light. But when night fell, the great hall transformed. Long trestle tables were cleared, rushes swept aside, and the space became a dormitory. Servants and retainers rolled out bedding along the cold flagstones, huddling close together for warmth. The enormous fireplaces that had blazed during the evening were reduced to glowing embers. Without fuel, their warmth quickly faded. Smoke drifted lazily into the rafters, where it lingered thick and stale. The grand hall, by day, a symbol of wealth and power, by night became a shadowy cavern, echoing with coughs, snores, and the restless shifting of those trying to keep warm. Imagine lying there, your body pressed against rough wool, the stone floor beneath you unyielding. The crackle of dying embers fades, replaced by the whisper of the wind against narrow windows. Outside, the howl of wolves carries across the countryside, reminding everyone inside that beyond these walls lay dangers more frightening than the cold. Not all beds were equal. For the lord and lady of the castle, privacy was a luxury afforded by thick curtains and carved wooden frames. Their chambers were often decorated with tapestries, not only for beauty but for insulation. These heavy fabrics trapped air, forming a fragile barrier against the chill. And yet, even within these chambers, sleep was not guaranteed. The lord and lady often shared their rooms with servants who slept on the floor, always within reach to attend their needs. Nobles were rarely truly alone. Even their dreams carried the weight of responsibility, managing estates, preparing for war, or safeguarding alliances. The cold may have been an enemy, but it was never the only one. Children too had to endure the freezing nights. Young heirs slept in smaller beds near their parents' chambers, while the children of servants shared crowded quarters, sometimes even curled beside animals for warmth. In letters and chronicles, we read of mothers placing warmed stones at the foot of their children's bedding, whispering prayers that they would not wake shivering or ill. The laughter of the day gave way to hushed murmurs at night, stories told to distract from the cold, lullabies sung softly beneath fur blankets. Childhood in the castle was shaped not only by duty and discipline, but also by these tender moments of survival. The medieval world was steeped in belief, and darkness was fertile ground for fear. Night was the domain of spirits, demons, and wandering souls. Many castles had chapels where prayers were whispered late into the night, warding off evil. Crosses were carved above doorways, charms were placed under pillows, and holy relics were clutched tight as protection. People told tales of ghosts roaming the battlements, of monks who appeared in candlelight, only to vanish into shadows of restless soldiers who marched eternally through stone corridors. Whether or not these tales were true, in the silence of a medieval night, with only a flickering candle for comfort, it was easy to believe. For the many servants who kept a castle alive, night was not always a time of rest. Some worked long into the dark hours, guarding doors, tending fires, or watching over the kitchens where embers glowed for the morning meal. Their quarters were the humblest of all, cramped wooden bunks or straw mats scattered in storerooms and stables. They shared space with tools, barrels, and sometimes with animals, whose body heat could mean the difference between comfort and freezing misery. Blankets were few, often patched with rough stitches. Many relied on layered tunics, cloaks, and whatever scraps of fur they could afford. The night was their reminder that life in a castle was not only about stone towers and banners, but about endurance. Servants carried the burden of survival on their shoulders, quietly, without songs or glory. Despite the hardships, people of the Middle Ages were resourceful. They devised clever ways to make sleep bearable. Beds were often shared, not just by couples, but by siblings, friends, and sometimes entire families, their collective warmth forming a natural shield against the cold. Some castles experimented with underfloor heating, using channels to direct hot air from fires into chambers. Others relied on thick rushes strewn across the floor, replaced regularly to absorb moisture and trap heat. In wealthier households, feather mattresses, fur-lined blankets, and hot stones wrapped in cloth brought a touch of comfort. Curtains around beds weren't just for privacy, they were practical too, creating a cocoon that held in warmth. In many ways, the medieval bed was a small fortress within the castle, protecting its sleeper from the cold, just as the outer walls protected them from enemies. When the first pale light crept across the sky, the castle stirred awake. For many, it was not a relief, but another duty-filled day. Fires had to be rekindled, halls swept, and bread baked in smoky ovens. Lords rose to attend councils, while soldiers readied themselves for patrols. The cold never fully disappeared. Even as the sun rose, the castle's thick stone walls held onto the night's chill, releasing it slowly into the air. Morning was less a new beginning than a continuation of endurance. And yet, within this daily rhythm, life persisted. Children laughed again, servants gossiped, and lords planned hunts or feasts. The castle was alive once more. So, what was it truly like to sleep in a medieval castle? It was not the dream we sometimes imagine, wrapped in silk beneath starlit towers. It was a test of resilience. Cold, crowded, and haunted by both superstition and responsibility, nights in the castle were as harsh as the days. And yet, within that struggle lay the story of human endurance. Every blanket shared, every prayer whispered, every ember tended through the dark, was a reminder of how people adapted, survived, and found meaning even in discomfort. Perhaps this is why castles continue to fascinate us, not only as symbols of power, but as places where humanity faced the elements with courage. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it still. The rustle of straw beds, the crackle of dying fires, the hush of voices telling stories to chase away the cold. When we think of castles today, we often see them through the eyes of tourists. Sunlit towers, tapestries hanging proudly, walls echoing with history. But for those who truly lived inside, the nights were something else entirely. Imagine stepping into one of those chambers now, not with modern lighting and polished tours, but as it once was. A small flame guttering in an iron holder, shadows stretching across bare stone, the draught whispering through a slit window. The scent of smoke clings to the air. A dog stirs at the foot of a bed. Somewhere, beyond the wall, an owl cries. In such silence, sleep was fragile, caught between fear and fatigue. And yet, people did sleep. They dreamed of hunts and harvests, of saints and sinners, of hopes for children and victories in battle. The stone may have been cold, but hearts and imaginations burned warm. Perhaps that is why these stories still touch us, because even in a world so different, the struggle for warmth, safety, and comfort is universal. We too seek soft beds, trusted company, and the courage to face the night. The medieval castle reminds us that history is not made of battles alone. It is made of nights like these, ordinary, difficult, and human. So the next time you see a castle rising against the sky, try to imagine not just the banners and battlements, but the lives within. The child tucked under a wool blanket, the servant curled against a wall, the Lord whispering a final prayer before sleep. These quiet moments, lost in time, are perhaps the truest echoes of the medieval world. Not everyone in the castle slept at night. Guards kept vigil on the cold battlements, their cloaks snapping in the wind. With only the glow of torches and the distant shimmer of stars, they marched the walls, stamping their feet to keep blood flowing. Their nights were long, and their sleep, when it came, was brief and restless. For them, the castle was not a sanctuary, but a duty. One mistake in the darkness, and enemies could breach the gates. Imagine standing there in silence, listening for movement in the forest below, the weight of hundreds of lives resting on your wakefulness. Sleep inside a castle was never truly quiet. Beyond the whispers of the wind and the crackle of the hearth, there were subtler sounds, the shuffle of servants, the groaning of timber beams, the distant drip of water echoing through stone passageways. Animals stirred too, dogs barking suddenly, horses stamping in the stables, owls hooting from the towers. To the modern ear, these noises might seem unsettling, but to those who lived there, they were the soundtrack of normal life, the castle breathing and shifting in the dark. Castles often hosted travelers, merchants, or envoys, and their sleeping arrangements were rarely luxurious. Guests might be given a corner of the great hall, or a modest chamber if one was available. They carried their own blankets, cloaks, and sometimes even straw, prepared for the discomfort of the road. To sleep in a castle as a visitor was to accept both honor and hardship. You were within walls of protection, but also within a community bound by discipline and hierarchy. The warmth you received depended less on the fire and more on your place in that order. The coldest nights came in winter, when snow pressed against arrow slits and icicles formed along the eaves. Water froze in pitchers, and the stone walls themselves seemed to radiate frost. In these months, sleep became a battle against nature. People layered furs, shared beds, and prayed for spring. Fires were kept burning longer, but wood was precious, and rationing was common. It was in winter, more than any other time, that the reality of castle life revealed itself. A fortress against enemies, yes, but never against the elements. When dawn came, the hardships of the night faded into routine. Yet in diaries, letters, and chronicles, echoes remain, mentions of sleeplessness, of prayers whispered into the darkness, of gratitude for one more morning. These fleeting records remind us that history is not only the grand events of kings and battles, it is also the quiet struggle of ordinary people, trying to rest within cold stone walls. Before sleep, many in the castle shared what was called the night meal. It was not lavish, often just bread, broth or ale, but it brought warmth before the long cold hours ahead. Some carried small clay pots of heated drink back to their beds, cradling them like treasures against the chill. Imagine sitting in the dim hall, your breath misting in the air, as servants handed out portions, the smell of smoke and bread mixed with damp stone. This simple ritual gave not only warmth, but comfort, the knowledge that you did not face the night alone. The cold nights of the castle were more than uncomfortable. They could be deadly. Illness spread quickly in crowded chambers, where people huddled together for warmth. Coughs echoed through the halls. Fevers raged, and medicine was scarce. Herbs were burned to purify the air. Amulets hung above beds to ward off plague, and prayers whispered to saints for protection. For many, the greatest fear was not the enemy at the gate, but the sickness carried in the shadows of the night. Sleep itself was seen as mysterious, even dangerous. Dreams were not random, but messages from God, from saints, or sometimes from darker forces. A pleasant dream could be taken as a blessing, a sign of favor. A nightmare, however, was a warning, or worse, a visitation from evil. Medieval people woke from such dreams trembling, clutching crosses, whispering protective prayers. In the silence of a castle at night, with cold air seeping in and shadows moving on the wall, it was easy to believe that dreams were more than just dreams. Not every night was grim. During great feasts or holy days, the castle came alive. Fires roared, music played, and people ate and drank until late hours. On these nights, warmth came not just from the hearth, but from laughter, from wine, from dancing feet on wooden floors. Yet even these nights ended the same way, the music fading, candles guttering, silence returning as bodies lay down in crowded chambers, the cold creeping back in as the last embers died. Through it all, The castle itself remained unchanged. The walls absorbed every breath, every whisper, every restless turn in the night. Stones do not sleep, but they remember. If you listen closely in such a place today, you might still hear them, the echoes of centuries of nights, voices layered one upon another. For the castle was never only a fortress of war, it was a fortress of human endurance, standing watch not just against enemies, but against the relentless passage of night after night, century after century. While most inside tried to sleep, someone was always awake. Guards stood on the battlements, cloaks whipping in the wind, torches barely fighting against the darkness. Their boots crunched on frozen stone. And every sound, an owl's cry, the rustle of trees, the faint snap of ice, felt like a threat. For them, the night was not a time of rest, but of vigilance. To be a castle guard was to sacrifice warmth and comfort, trading it for duty and fear of what might approach through the darkness. Castles were never silent. Dogs barked in the courtyards, horses shifted in their stables, and mice scurried across the rushes on the floor. Cats prowled in search of rats, their eyes glowing in torchlight. Bats darted through cracks in the roofs, and sometimes, in the dead of winter, owls nested in the towers. For those lying awake, these sounds were constant reminders that life, small, fragile, and restless, moved all around them, even in the coldest hours. Most castles relied on flickering candles or small oil lamps to light the night. The glow was never steady. It danced across stone walls, turning shadows into shifting shapes. A coat of armor might look like a ghostly figure. A tapestry might ripple like it was breathing. To sleep in such a room was to live half in dream and half in waking fear, for every shadow held the possibility of something more, an intruder, a spirit, or simply the tricks of a tired mind. In some households, before everyone scattered to their chambers, stories were told by the fire. They could be holy tales of saints, grim warnings of demons, or epic sagas of kings and knights. Servants listened wide-eyed, children clutched each other, and nobles smiled knowingly, pretending not to fear the same things. These tales served a purpose. They passed the hours, yes, but they also gave people courage to face the cold night. To fall asleep after a story was to feel less alone, even if the story itself was terrifying. For the deeply religious, the night was not just a time of rest, but of devotion. Monks and priests in castle chapels rose for midnight prayers, their chants echoing softly through stone corridors. Candles flickered on altars, casting halos of light against carved walls. To hear those prayers in the distance was both eerie and comforting, a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest hours, faith was awake. Eventually, the noises faded. Fires burned down to embers, guards grew weary, animals curled into sleep, and the castle became still. The silence was so heavy, you could feel it pressing against your ears. Only the occasional drip of water or the groan of wood under frost reminded you that the world still moved. In that silence, your own heartbeat sounded loud, your breath formed clouds, and you realized that the greatest challenge of a medieval night wasn't just the cold. It was the endless waiting for dawn. The night has been long. You've felt the cold gnaw at your bones, heard the restless echoes of the great halls, smelled the smoke clinging to your clothes, and listened to the silence that seemed heavier than stone itself. Hours have passed, though it feels like centuries. And then, just when your body has nearly surrendered to exhaustion, you notice it. A faint change in the air. Through the narrow slit of a window, the black of night softens to a muted grey. The wind quiets. The castle, which all night seemed like a tomb of frozen stone, begins to stir. Somewhere in the courtyard, a rooster crows, his voice breaking the silence. Boots scrape on the battlements as guards change watch. Servants rise from their straw mats, pulling cloaks tighter, shuffling toward the kitchens to spark the first fires of the day. Inside your chamber, the cold is still biting. Your breath still clouds the air, but something subtle has shifted. The hopelessness of night is gone. In its place is a fragile promise that warmth, light, and life will return. You push aside the heavy curtains of your bed and stand, boots crunching on rushes. The stone beneath your feet is just as icy as before, yet you feel stronger because you have endured. You walk to the window slit and peer out. The horizon glows faintly gold, Mist curling off the frozen ground. Beyond the walls, the world is waking. The castle groans to life too. Smoke rises from the kitchens. Dogs bark as they're unchained. And the first voices echo across the courtyard. The long night is over. The day may bring battles, or work, or hardship, but at least it brings light. And so, you realize the truth. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just measured by victories on the battlefield or wealth at the feast. It was measured in nights endured, in the simple triumph of making it through the cold and seeing the dawn. You step back from the window. The stone walls remain as unforgiving as ever, but they no longer feel like a prison. They are witnesses, witnesses to your endurance, to the endurance of countless lives before you. The torches sputter, the rooster crows again, and a servant knocks softly on your door. Morning has come. You survived the night in the castle,